biodiversity and has studied pollinator habitat restoration, bee nesting habits, and the effects of pest management practices on wild bee communities. Exactly what we are trying to learn more about here. Her work with Xerces since 2015 has focused on supporting pollinators in the Northeast through habitat creation and mitigating pesticide risk. So thank you for coming from New Haven. We appreciate it, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm very excited to finally have come up part of the pollinator pathway and have seen some of the coneflower alongside of the roads. It's really exciting. We talk about you a lot in pollinator presentations now as a model for community engagement. So I'm very excited to be here. If you have already seen a Xerces presentation, a lot of this will be a refresher, but I'm going to talk a lot about the native bee diversity here in Connecticut, and hopefully get you excited to go observe pollinators in your backyard. So Xerces is a conservation organization that's been around since the 70s. That our mission is to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. So we have major programs. Our biggest program is in pollinator conservation and agricultural biodiversity. But we also have programs focused specifically on endangered species and aquatic invertebrates. I'm part of the very small pesticide program. We're growing, but small, at Xerces, which works with farmers to do pest management, risk assessments for pollinators, and try and mitigate risk on different farms. But we have staff across the country. We're largely member supported, but we also receive grants to help provide technical assistance to farmers. And we've done outreach to many thousands of farm and agricultural professionals since 2008, and have supported the creation of nearly 500,000 acres of habitat across the U.S., including a lot in the Midwest as well as the West Coast, and we have staff here in Connecticut as well as in Maine and New Jersey. But I'll start with some of the basics. Why do we need pollinators? What do they do? More than 85% of flowering plants require an animal, which is chiefly insects, to move pollen from the male parts of a flower to the female parts of a flower to set fruit and seeds. So because plants can't move, they're relying on animals or wind in some cases to move that pollen and result in seed and fruit formation. So what needs pollination? There are really many plants that provide us with our micronutrients and vitamins are pollinated by insects. So pollinators are responsible for 35% of global crop production, which is worth a lot of money. And it's sometimes said that pollinators are responsible for 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we eat. It also provides a lot of the color on our plates. So this is the produce section of a Whole Foods with bee pollinated crops, and then without bee pollinated crops. So 1 out of every 3 bites we eat comes from pollinators, and some of the things that I most depend on, like coffee, also comes from pollinated plants. But who does pollination? So this is a little green sweat bee, and I'll talk more about them, some of my favorites. But there's many different kinds of insects that move between flowers and will move pollen. Some are better at it than others. So butterflies move from flower to flower. I've seen a lot of monarchs this year, so they've been moving from mostly milkweed to milkweed. Moths and flies and beetles. Flies are underrated pollinators. There's a lot of them out there moving from flower to flower. I hope you can see these. But really, the chief pollinators of the insect world are bees. And that's in part because there's a few characteristics of bees that make them really good and efficient pollinators. So bees are kind of like vegetarian wasps. Where wasps bring back soft-bodied insects to feed their young, bees are bringing back pollen to feed their young. So they're actively going and collecting and transporting pollen and bringing it back to raise their young. They're also exhibiting, bees tend to exhibit flower constancy. So that means that once they have gone to a specific kind of flower, they've learned how to handle that flower and get pollen out of it, they tend to go back to the same species. You have some species of bees that specialize on a particular kind of flower, so they're really good at pollinating that flower and they depend on it for their young. And then you have bees like bumblebees that are generalists, but once they've learned how to get pollen effectively out of a flower, they'll take that, they'll continue to visit the same one, which makes them a good pollinator because it means they're not bringing in pollen from a different species. So they're moving pollen between the same species. Bees are what we call central place foragers. So they found a nest. Sometimes it's above ground, sometimes it's below ground. We'll talk about different kinds of bees that live in different places, but they're foraging around that nest. So if you have them in your backyard, that bee that's living in your backyard is foraging around your yard. The one that you might think of when you think of what's a bee, what's happening in my backyard, is the honeybee. The European honeybee was brought over by settlers back in the 1600s with some of the original colonists even. But it's facing a lot of challenges now. It's our #1 agricultural pollinator because it can be managed. It can be trucked around, hives taken around the country. But it's facing a lot of challenges for disease, pests, and it's bringing some of those diseases and pests to our wild bees that are living in and around our homes and farms. So I'm actually going to talk mostly about the native bees that we have living in and around, free-living bees in our communities. So across the US, there's nearly 3,600 species of native bees, and there's about 350 species of native bees in Connecticut. Wild bees span a huge gamut of sizes and shapes and furriness and colors. They're pretty amazing. Sorry, I think I have automatic timing going on this. But they contribute to the pollination of many different wild and managed plants. Tomato, squash, cucumbers, eggplants, many different fruits. And there's hundreds of species here. So wild pollinators are really important to pollination of crops. There was a recent big analysis of many different crops and found that wild pollinators improved fruit set at twice the rate of honeybees, and that more diverse pollinator communities produce more and higher quality fruits, nuts, and vegetables. So some of that is behavior, like when wild bees are present, honeybees are more efficient, so they cause honeybees to move around more. Honeybees can kind of get stuck in a certain row. So when a wild bee comes and interacts with a honeybee, it moves it to a different row and improves total pollination. And some of it is that many wild bees are really efficient pollinators. This is a mining bee on peach. Mining bees come out in the early spring, and many of them are super efficient pollinators. They're just really good at transporting pollen. So there's 3 sort of broad, overgeneralized categories of native bees, but hopefully they help us sort of separate them out. So we have bumblebees, which are most similar to honeybees because they're social. So they live in colonies that are led by a queen. And then you have solitary wild bees, some of which live underground and some of which live above ground in cavities and tunnels. So bumblebees, the big furry ones that you'll see out and about buzzing, live in social colonies that range from a couple dozen workers to a couple hundred workers. They really love to live in old rodent burrows where there's old hair and things that they can use to create this very messy nest. So bumblebees are kind of like messy honeybees. They're disorganized honeybees. They also make honey, but they keep it in ways that we definitely can't extract from, these little wax buckets. They also love to nest under bunch grasses, so a lot of times I'll recommend putting in tussocky grass or a bunch grass, like big blue stem, that eventually, once there's enough sort of dried grasses, they'll burrow in underneath the roots of that bunch grass. Bumblebees are really excellent pollinators. So they're some of the bees that can produce what's called buzz pollination, which is really great for plants like tomatoes that hold their pollen up inside a porocidal anther, so the pollen's contained within the anthers. So what they do is they come up to the flower and they use their wing muscles to buzz really quickly at a high frequency, and it's like a salt shaker getting that pollen out from inside the flower. So tomatoes and blueberries, those kinds of flowers really benefit from bees that can buzz pollinate. So bumblebees can do it, sweat bees can do it, honeybees can't do it at all. They just don't have that behavior. So the life cycle of a bumblebee colony is you have, at this time of year, let's start in the spring. So the spring, a queen has come out, has hibernated over the winter. You have a solitary female that comes out in the spring, in early spring, that starts founding a nest. And at this point in her life cycle, she's sort of acting like a solitary bee. She is a single female doing all of the work here. She's going out collecting pollen, coming back, laying eggs. Once that first brood of eggs hatches, sort of early summer, she'll retire to the nest and just take over egg production while her offspring go out and collect pollen and nectar. So where we are right here is about the time when she's starting to produce new queens and males. And so they will come out in early fall and mate. And then the new queens, the rest of the colony will senesce and die off, and the new queens will go out and find a place to overwinter. So it's an annual colony with a social period in the middle of the summer where there's a queen doing the egg production and workers that are doing the foraging outside of the nest. A solitary bee is one that does not have a period where she has daughters taking care of tasks within the nest. It's always just a single female taking care of all the tasks within the nest. So this is a mining bee. Most mining bees are present in sort of early spring. So she'll come out and she'll start digging a new nest. So I don't know if you can hear me, but this is a cell underground where she will lay a pollen and nectar ball and then lay an egg on top of that pollen and nectar ball. The egg will develop off of the pollen and nectar stores in that ball and remain underground. So it'll pupate underground and come out the next spring. So all of this is being done by a single female. Once she's finished off a cell, she'll close it off and then dig another cell somewhere else. So these bees are digging down anywhere from 5 centimeters to almost a meter down underground. So about 70% of our native bees nest underground, and they have lots of different architectures. So this is a bee nest, there's the soil surface, and it's coming down all the way down here, almost a meter down, to lay these tiny little pollen and nectar balls and eggs. Some of these bees, so cellophane bees and mining bees especially, will line their nest with these waxy secretions that resist flooding, so they can lay these eggs in more moist soils, where others are looking for really sandy, drier soils where they're not going to have moisture issues. So different kinds of bees like different kinds of soils. But really what they're looking for are sort of these bare patches where they can dig in, and there's also a little bit of sun warmth on the top of the soil. So one of the things I like to recommend is if you like mulch, mulch is generally great for conserving soil moisture and keeping your weeding issues low in the garden, but I also like to leave some bare patches maybe around the back of the garden where bees might be able to more easily get into that soil surface. So these are mining bees, are also called digger bees. Many of them are sort of small to medium size, so smaller than a honeybee. A lot of them have this dark abdomen with a pale yellow thorax. And most of them are early spring bees that love willows and apples and other rosaceous trees. Many of them nest sort of independently, but some of them like to nest in what we call aggregations. So sometimes you'll come across a patch of soil that has tons of these little holes. They'll just be like perfect little dime, even smaller than dime-sized holes. And if you watch long enough, you might see a bee come out. But it's a little challenging sometimes when it's just a single female going in and out. But they're really important pollinators for tree fruit and berry crops. Then midsummer, we have, these are sometimes also called digger bees or longhorn bees, but these are some of our sunflower bees, so Melisodes. The reason they're called longhorn bees is pretty obvious. They have really long antennae. So the males especially have super long antennae. And the females can be sort of distinguished. They're about honeybee sized, but they have this robust abdomen, and then they have these cool hairy legs that is where they collect their pollen dry. But if you have sunflowers or other sunflower family plants in your yard, you'll sometimes see them burrowing around in the middle of the plant. And sometimes you'll see, 4 or 5 males on the same sunflower plant with their long horns. So these love to nest really deeply. So at least on farms, we're recommending avoiding deep tillage of areas, especially around where you have plants in the sunflower family. Then there's sweat bees, which are, this is one of the most diverse bee families, is the sweat bee family. And you have bees that range from these little tiny black things that you think might be wasps or even fleas or something, to larger bees that are about the size of a honeybee that have white stripes on their abdomen. So most of these are grayish to black. Some of them have pale bands on their abdomen. And then there's also green sweat bees, which I'll talk about next. But these are really interesting bees. Some of them are solitary. Some of them have developed sort of sub-social characteristics where there's 3 sisters that are running a nest together. So some of them have nest entrances that operate more like apartment buildings, where they're sort of, they have a communal nest entrance, but then they have their own spaces underneath the entrance, but they're all using the same one and defending from predators. Some of them also have multiple generations a year. And then green sweat bees, which are some of the most beautiful bees out there. They're these iridescent green color, some of which are green all the way through their bodies, and some of them have little pale bands on the abdomen. But they are generalist bees. They'll pollinate many different species. They can also buzz pollinate like bumblebees. So they're really good for blueberries and tomatoes. Again, some of these will nest communally like an apartment building, but each female is building and provisioning her own brood cells. One of these bees, which I think is this one down here, will nest in rotting logs. So it's one of the few bees that nests in rotting wood. But if you have, an old piece of wood that you think, oh, I should get rid of that, you might have some green sweat bees nesting in there. Also in like a dead snag. Those can be some of the best nesting habitat once they've already been chewed out by beetles. Squash bees were not originally part of the New England ecosystem, but as humans moved up, bringing squash up from Mesoamerica, squash bees moved along with them. So these bees are obligate pollinators, meaning they specialize on cucurbit pollen. That's the only thing that they feed their offspring. And they always nest in or near the crop. So if you have a squash field that's been present for a long time, a lot of times you have squash bees as well. So if you have squash flowers and you think, hey, what's that in there early in the morning? It's probably a male squash bee that's waiting for a female to come out for her early morning foraging visit, so he can just kind of hop on. So they kind of look like honeybees, but they're a bit more orange. They also have kind of a protruding snout. They're sort of similar also to the sunflower bees in that a lot of them have longer antennae. But they're really cool bees, and they'll nest right underneath squash plants. And then finally, for our ground nesting bees, rounding it out, we have cellophane bees. And they're called cellophane bees because they secrete a substance that's a lot like cellophane. It's that waxy substance that they'll line the inside of their nests. So their underground nests are protected from flooding and really moist soil conditions. They also look similar to honeybees. So we have a lot of bees here that are very similar to honeybees. So it takes a lot of observing to sort of parcel out, oh, well, what did I just see? So these bees, sometimes it's just time of season. These bees tend to come out really early in the year and be tree pollinators. So you'll see this bee pollinating apples and other trees early in the year. The other 30% of native bees live above ground in tunnels and cavities. So here we have a small carpenter bee living in a rubus, so a raspberry stem. And they'll live in old beetle holes. They'll also live in hollow reeds or bamboo. And some of these bees are starting to be commercially managed for certain crops, but that's still that's an industry that's in its infancy. So, but plants with pithy stems like sumac and blackberry and elderberry can be really important nesting sites for these kinds of bees. So just to show you what's going on inside of a hollow reed, this would be an example here where the female has come in from this side and she starts at the back. She'll form a mud partition. This is a mason bee nest where she'll put this pollen mass, a pollen and nectar ball, lay an egg, go out, get some mud, form a partition, lay another egg on some pollen and nectar, and so forth. And what's cool about bees is that the female can determine whether she's having a female or male offspring. So she'll lay females farther back in the nest, and then males farther to the front where they're maybe more vulnerable to parasites and predators, but also so that they can come out earlier in the spring and they're ready to mate once the females have come out from the back of the nest. So these bees will form these silk cocoons, they'll pupate, and then emerge in the springtime. So this is how they'll overwinter in this cocoon form. So mason and orchard bees are some of the bees that nest in these tunnels. They are small to medium size. Some of them have this bluish green metallic color if you look closely, with some pale hairs on top, and some are closer to maybe a honeybee coloration, but much furrier. One thing that distinguishes them from a honeybee is where they collect their pollen. So where honeybees collect their pollen wet on the backs of their legs, so they'll have these sort of wet balls hanging from the back of their legs here, and they'll pack it into the like a scooped out back leg. Mason bees collect their pollen on scopal hairs, so pollen collecting hairs that are underneath their abdomen. So they'll just kind of belly flop onto a flower, rustle around, and then that's where all the pollen will end up. So this is one that is nectaring on an apple flower, but usually you'll sort of see those belly flop right onto those anthers, which makes them really good tree fruit pollinators. Because they nest in tunnels, they also have sort of broader heads than and big mandibles that help them excavate some of those hollow reeds. Leafcutter bees are closely related to mason bees, but instead of using mud to partition their nest, they are using leaves. So if you've ever wondered why you have a perfectly round circle cut out of plants in your yard like this, it's probably a leafcutter bee that's partitioning their nest with those leaves. They tend to be black and white with this sort of yellow pollen-covered underside. Sometimes too, when you see them on a flower, they'll actually have this back end kind of up. So it almost maybe looks more like a fly, the way that they sit, but they'll keep their back end up while they're sort of flying around. Some of the leaves, we're learning more about how they choose different leaves, but some of the leaves we're learning have different antifungal properties. So they know to go to certain species that are going to help keep fungus problems down inside of their nest. Carpenter bees also live above ground. You might be familiar with them in your sheds or in your decks. They are very large. They look like bumblebees. The main distinguishing characteristic for bumblebees versus carpenter bees in our area is that the back of the abdomen of a carpenter bee is shiny, where a bumblebee would be furry and just kind of a matte color. But they look very similar. Also, you'll note there's a yellow face patch on the males. So males don't have stingers and they can't sting you. If you see a carpenter bee buzzing around and making noise near your deck and you see it has a yellow face patch, then you really have nothing to worry about. They're just being territorial. But what's amazing about these bees, they have insect eggs that are half of the mom's body size. So it takes a lot of energy for her to produce an egg. And they don't produce that many offspring per year. So they're usually going in and excavating a nest in wood. They'll often reuse the same nest hole from year to year. And then we have small carpenter bees, which don't look anything like large carpenter bees. They are sort of a metallic blue color. You'll mostly think they're wasps. They don't really have very many hairs on them that would distinguish them as a bee. But if you have things nesting in your blackberry or raspberry stems, it's probably small carpenter bees. So they nest sort of sub-socially. They'll have multiple females come out of a single hole. Some of them will go up one way in a stem, and some of them will go down the other way. And they're active all the way through the season. So I'll talk a little bit about this. This is commercial management of some of these tunnel nesting bees. So mason bees, the blue orchard bee, Osmia lignaria on the East Coast. There are a couple other mason bees that are managed commercially. Also, the alfalfa leafcutter bee is managed out on the west. So these are being brought in for crops like apples, as well as almonds in some cases, other tree fruit. The alfalfa leafcutter bee is obviously being brought in for alfalfa. And I bring this up in part to say it's a promising industry in terms of diversifying pollination, but there's a lot of pitfalls in terms of, we've learned a lot about managing bees from honeybees, and we've learned that when you bring a lot of bees together, you have to be very careful about sanitation. So individual bee hotels in people's backyards, we're not that worried about, but when you bring this many bees together, you start to see issues with parasite buildup and parasite load and predator load when you have lots and lots of these bees together. So we urge great caution when you're looking at commercial management of these bees, and really practicing good annual sanitation practices. So there are good resources for that online, but again, if you just have a single bee hotel in your backyard, we're not that worried about it because you are just providing them with a nesting resource. All right, the final kind of bee I'm talking about today is the cuckoo bee. These are nest parasites. These are kind of a biologist's dream, but not a bee's dream. These are bees that will take over a nest, kill the host, and then lay their eggs on top of their resources. So just like a cuckoo bird. A lot of them have this kind of armored look, like you really don't want them coming into your nest. And some of them look very much like wasps. They don't have any pollen collecting hairs. That's not what they're good at. They're good at taking over a nest and laying their own eggs in it. But many of these bees are declining in tandem with native bees that are also in decline. So their host species are in decline. These bees are even more precipitously in decline. But some of them have very cool coloration, and we're still learning a lot about who is the host species for whom, and what they go for, what do they cue in on. So why am I here talking to you about pollinators tonight? It's because we're concerned about how they're doing generally, and I want to tell you what you can do to conserve them in your own backyards. So across the country, we're dealing largely with habitat loss. This is the main driver of pollinator declines, is the loss of really diverse grassland, prairie ecosystems, forest edges that have been converted to cropland or pushed out to build larger fields. The removal of tree lines and hedgerows also reduces this insect habitat in the landscape. So, and this is not just far away, happened 150 years ago, this is happening now. So this is land conversion from 2008 to 2012 of areas of previously uncultivated land that was converted to agriculture. So largely, this is the Great Plains, but we have land conversioning happening up and down the East Coast as well. And we see the same patterns in urban areas, so we lose habitat here as well to development and urbanization. So intact habitat is often limited to riparian zones and edges and parkland, and where habitat does exist, it's not connected. So that's why we're really excited about projects like the Pollinator Pathway here that are thinking on a landscape scale about how do we connect different patches of habitat so that bees can move through this landscape and disperse and have resources to live on. In many urban and suburban environments, lawns are also monocultures. So we have monocultures of crops out throughout the Midwest, up and down the West Coast, but here in an urban area, we also have monocultures of lawns. There's over 40 million acres of lawn, and many people are managing that for different pest outbreaks. They like to use a lot of pesticides to keep that looking pristine. So, but having a monoculture is what creates the conditions for those kinds of pest outbreaks. So lawns and ornamental plants tend to support fewer pollinators and beneficial insects than the native plants that are adapted to the ecosystems that existed there before. And I could talk at length about pesticides. I don't have more slides in here about pesticides, but if you have questions about anything related to pesticides and pollinators, I can certainly answer them after this talk. I'm mainly here to say that pollinators need to be protected from the impacts of pesticides, especially insecticides, and that their habitat needs to be protected from that as well. So insecticides are designed to kill insects. That means that many of them are very toxic to bees. They can be acutely toxic as well as toxic at sublethal levels, so things that impact reproduction or behavior, the ability to forage, that sort of thing. So the main thing here is just to keep, when you're thinking about putting in habitat, think about how can I keep it clean from pesticides. So we know that bees are in some difficulty, that they've lost a lot of habitat and that they're exposed to pesticides across much of what habitat is left. What do we need to conserve them? The key ingredient is clean habitat. So the amount of natural habitat that's present in a landscape has a direct influence on bee abundance and diversity. We've seen it time and again, study after study. Wildflower meadow goes in, bee abundance and diversity climbs over time. And what habitat means is food, shelter, and refuge. So food is nectar and pollen and host plants for butterflies and other beneficial insects. Shelter, so nesting sites, overwintering sites, and then protection from pesticides. So wildflower habitat is planting diverse flowering species that directly enhance bee abundance and diversity. The quality and the composition of that habitat matters. Better quality means better resources for beneficial insects. So if you look around on your property, you probably already have habitat for bees and in some form. So you might have an unmanaged or an unmowed or a fallow area with some flowering plants in it, like goldenrods, asters. You might have some flowering trees and shrubs, early spring flowering plants, like willows and maples. You might have some decaying trees and snags or patches of bare ground that provide those nesting resources. But if you're looking to sort of design your landscape so that it really benefits pollinators deliberately, what they really need is a succession of diverse bloom that covers spring, summer, through fall. So all the times when pollinators are present. Really, as soon as it warms up in spring, the bumblebees come out, followed by the mining bees, and then you have bees that are present all the way through the warm period, all the way through October, early November. So for this reason, it's really important that pollinator habitat contain a diversity of plants throughout that season that provide them with continuous resources that they can collect pollen and nectar from. So in the back of the room, if you didn't, I hope you were able to get a handout. There was actually this plant list. Thank you for providing that. We have plant lists. These are also available on our website. We have recommended pollinator plant lists for this region. But the idea behind this is just one idea for what a pollinator mix could look like based on some of the species that we've had success with in the past. But creating a mix that has bloom period in mind and then having multiple species present for each of those bloom periods. And if you sort of have a diversity of colors and shapes, that's going to cover a lot of different kinds of pollinators. Many different species are generalists, but for example, bumblebees are longer tongued than sweat bees. So sweat bees are going to prefer something like coreopsis, or that they can land on and doesn't have much depth to it. Whereas bumblebees might like the nectar rewards of a plant that they have to sort of burrow into. So let's see. Like bottle gentian is actually an example of a plant that can only be pollinated by a bee that's as large as a bumblebee. They use their strong forearms to get in there, and there's a really valuable nectar reward at the bottom of the flower. So this is a good starting point if you're looking at a plant list, but creating something similar to this for your backyard is how you should be thinking about creating habitat from spring through fall. If you want to go a little bit deeper, you can think about host plants. So some bees are really specialized. So there's a bee that specializes only on mock orange. That's the only plant that it forages on. Then those longhorn bees specialize on plants in the sunflower family. So it's not just one plant, but it is just sort of a narrow suite of plants. And then there's species like sweat bees that are largely generalists and will forage on most anything that you put in their path as long as they can get into it. Many butterflies and moths also need specific host plants. So if you're interested in designing a pollinator garden that's focused on butterflies, I would recommend you check out the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center resources online. They have great plant lists for butterfly host plants for many different species, and they can do it regionally specific native plant lists. If you're going to your local garden center and you're wondering what should you do, choose local native species. And I'd say a general rule of thumb is avoid cultivated plant varieties. So garden varieties that are double petaled are actually replacing the anthers of the plant, so the things that provide pollen, with extra petals. So they're not actually providing real resources for bees in many cases. So they look great, but they often are offering very little nectar and pollen. So what we recommend is looking for locally sourced, native, pesticide-free plants and seeds. The other thing to really check out Many of the larger garden centers are starting to phase out the use of neonicotinoids. I don't know if you've heard about these. These are systemic pesticides that are expressed throughout the plant, which makes them great for defending against sucking insects that will, like aphids or whiteflies. But they are also expressed in pollen and nectar, and they are toxic to bees. So if they are, many garden centers and nurseries have in the past used neonicotinoids because they are safer to human health, but they are very toxic to bees. And if you're not sure, I would ask at the garden center, are these plants pesticide free? Are they neonicotinoid free before you plant them out in your yard? But thankfully, thanks to a lot of consumer pressure, a lot of the larger garden centers are phasing those out. If they haven't already, many of them are phasing them out by next year. Another suite of plants to really think about for your yards are early spring trees and shrubs. So things like willows and maples and cherries, hawthorns and serviceberries provide this really important resource in the vulnerable time when bees first come out. We've had a lot of really weird spring warm-ups recently where things are warming up and bees are coming out, and sometimes plants are blooming and sometimes they're not. What we think the best way to protect against those early springs is to have a diversity of plants that bloom in early spring, and hopefully something is blooming at the time that your bumblebees are starting to come out in early spring. You get a real reward from looking at bees if you can get close enough. This is a mining bee on willow that is absolutely saturated in willow pollen. So they provide a really important resource for these bees in early spring. On the nesting habitat side, it's sometimes it's just letting it be. You have a lot of nesting habitat already if you have soil. But things that you can do specifically to provide nesting habitat are to allow a few bare areas, to plant some bunch grasses like big blue stem, and also some pithy stemmed plants like raspberries and blackberries. For those plants, if you have some dead canes, you can sort of clip off the ends of those canes to open up a hole that a bee could get into easily. And then also to leave, where possible, brush piles and snags. So brush piles, especially of things like hollow stemmed plants. So a summary of what that looks like is identifying and protecting what you already have. So if you have your early spring trees and shrubs, not cutting them down. Protecting nests where you find them and protecting nesting habitat. Avoiding pesticide use, especially anywhere near flowering plants. And then to create new, diverse, continuous bloom habitat. The last thing I'm going to talk about here is to talk about engaging the community, which is something that's already happening in this area, but some of the steps that we encourage you to take when you're thinking about how you can best be a pollinator supporter. So if you haven't looked at Bumblebee Watch already, if you want to get more involved with looking at bees in your garden, taking pictures of them, you don't know what it is, maybe you want an expert opinion on what bumblebees you have in your yard, I would recommend you Google Bumblebee Watch. This is a citizen science collaboration between Xerces and a few other organizations that provides a hub for gathering and identifying photos of bumblebees submitted by volunteers across the country. So it has these neat little identification guides if you're interested in poking around. You're like, oh, what did I have? But you can also submit your photos for expert identification. So this really cool citizen science project has actually led to discoveries and data points of rare species needing protection and documentations of species ranges hundreds of miles. In some cases, there were occurrences hundreds of miles outside of the previously documented range, which is pretty neat. So there's more than 24,000 records that have already been submitted into Bumblebee Watch, and that has included endangered and as well as invasive bumblebee species. So we have lots of people that are already putting in Bumblebee Watch observations in this area, but you just take out your phone, snap a picture, and then pop it online, and someone will help identify it. Another thing you can look at is the Pollinator Protection Pledge, which is part of our Bring Back the Pollinators pledge, Bring Back the Pollinators campaign. So this is pretty simple. It's sort of a summary of the things that I've talked about here today. To bring back the pollinators, I'll grow a variety of pollinator-friendly flowers that bloom from spring to fall, protect and provide nest sites and host plants, avoid using pesticides, and talk to my neighbors about the importance of pollinators. So this is a pledge that over 2,000 people have already taken, and it's just a way to signal, I'm really interested in conserving these pollinators, and I'm ready to talk to my neighbors about it as well. So there's more resources about the pledge on our website, which is just Xerces, Xerces.org. One thing I also encourage you to do if you're worried about manicured lawns and maybe you're creating a messy lawn, but you want to advertise to others that this is something you're doing deliberately, is to put up a habitat sign. I have one in my yard. One of my favorite things that I would love to publish a book on is called mullet gardening, which is business in the front, party in the back. So you have like a neat manicured front lawn, and then chaos in the back, which is all for pollinators and other wildlife. But I have party in the front and party in the back because more flowers is always good for bees and other wildlife. But if you do have a pollinator garden, you can register it on the Million Pollinator Garden Challenge, which is a campaign to register 1 million pollinator gardens across the country. And I think they already have several thousand in here, but millionpollinatorgardens.org. But like I said at the beginning, like Louise said at the beginning, the Ridgefield Pollinator Pathway and neighboring towns' Pollinator Pathway is such a great example of community engagement around pollinators. We're so excited that this initiative is happening. Connecting habitat patches in a concerted way is, I think, one of the best ways to think about pollinators on the scale that they are using the landscape. So bumblebees are traveling something like 3 miles to get different resources for their nest. They're trying to get the perfect balance of protein to lipid content for their offspring in the pollen that they're collecting. Sometimes that means they're going up and down looking for the right plants to balance that content for their offspring. So the more pollinator resources you have in a connected way is great for pollinators. So I'm so excited to be here in the middle of it. I think that's pretty much it for me. I wanted to direct you to our website, again, Xerces.org, where we do have pretty much anything you could possibly want about pollinators and other beneficial insects. We have plant guides for many different regions around the country. We have resources on milkweeds, butterfly host plants, beneficial insects, resources on pesticides. So if you're interested in any of that, check out our website. And many thanks for bringing me here.
Questions. You made me think of so many things I want to say. The Pollinator Pathway has a website. It's pollinator-pathway.org. And some of the things on there are resources like where you can buy truly native plants in the area. There are a couple good places. Earth Tones in Woodbury. But there's a new store in Fairfield called Native that is just gorgeous, and he's sourced the seeds from a 100-mile radius, and it's like amazing. So head up there. It's like only 8 months old. And then we're getting Pollinator Pathway. This site is on the Pollinator Pathway, little metal discs that you can just put in your yard. We're hoping they replace the yellow pesticide sign with the line through the child. And also as part of the Pollinator Pathway, you can have a garden club member come to your yard and help you identify what you already have that's native, what's invasive, where you might be able to let it look a little messy, and just to give you general counsel on how to do this. So if you're interested in that, sign up in the back, and there's Kitsy. And then just put a little note that you would like a visit, and we'll work that out. Sorry, I just wanted to say that before.
Any questions?
Yeah. What is an invasive bumblebee?
So when commercial bumblebees were introduced in the United States, there's not very many invasive bumblebees in the United States, but there are, there are invasive bumblebees in other areas of the world that were released when commercial bumblebees were brought from Europe to other areas of the world. So there's an invasive bumblebee in South America that's starting to force out some of the native bumblebees. There's a beautiful bee called Bombus dalbomii, which is about this big. It's almost the size of your palm, and it requires a lot of resources to maintain itself. But Bombus terrestris, which is the commercial bumblebee that was brought in, escaped its hives and has started to colonize and push out that native bumblebee from its range.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
When we have the early springs and the thaws, and then it freezes again, does that kill off bees and other pollinators?
It's a great question. I think that's one of the great risks of changing climate for bees is, yes, when you have a hard frost or multiple hard frosts after bees have already come out, many of those bees are not going to survive that hard frost, that killing frost, especially if it wipes out floral resources at the same time. So we had, when I was doing my master's in Michigan, we had one of those springs, and I was monitoring bee communities before and after. We saw some bees, a few bees, those early spring bees really tank, and it took maybe about 3 years for them to start to get back to some of their population levels from before we had that spring. So if you have it happen again and again, I think we're going to see some major risks for those early spring bees. I think good question. Yeah.
I know you didn't want to get into pesticides too much, but how much of a sanctuary space is needed for them to have a safe area to like graze? Like, is our yard enough? Is having neighbors that are spraying, is that a problem? Like, what is the?
So that's a really tough question. I think any areas that are provided for them that are a refuge from areas in the vicinity that are being sprayed is great. It's going to provide them with some clean resources. I don't know that we have really a number on in terms of acreage of one versus the other. It's much more difficult when you are right up against a neighbor that's spraying. You'd be wanting to look at other mitigation practices like, a windbreak of conifers or something like that to try and really protect some of the plants that are in your yard if you have somebody spraying right next to you.
Yeah.
But in terms of numbers, I don't necessarily have the answer.
Yeah.
As much as you can.
Just as like a follow-up, has anybody worked on that? And is it a problem if your neighbor is growing something that is native but is spraying it so that does the bee know the difference?
Some pesticides are repellent, so in some cases the bee might be able to tell, okay, this has been sprayed, I'm going to find something else. In some cases it's not repellent. There's been some work on neonicotinoids that shows that they're actually kind of addictive for some bees once they start foraging on them because it's like a nicotine. It depends on what it is and when it's sprayed and how it's sprayed. With some of the systemic products like neonicotinoids that are persistent and also very water soluble, they're able to move. If you have somebody who's applying, for example, a neonic-treated corn or soybean crop right next to you, you are probably getting some movement, off-site movement of that neonicotinoid into plants in the neighboring yard or farm. So it's definitely something that we're really concerned about, and we're trying to look at possible mitigation practices, as well as just trying to get different preventive practices on the farm that can replace neonic treatments on seeds. I think that's really what we would like to see in terms of adoption, is changing pest management practices to eliminate the use of those products.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I had a question about using deer spray. Do you know if that keeps the pollinators off the plants too?
I'm not sure. I would say there are a lot of products that are repellent, so a lot of the essential oils can be repellent to bees. I'm not sure what that deer spray product has in it, but do you know?
A lot of them have urine in them.
Urine?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's been looked at. I wouldn't be surprised if it's somewhat repellent. Bees are pretty sensitive to highly, potent smells. You had a question?
It was about deer spray.
Oh, okay, great.
Have manufacturers of neonicotinoids agreed that they are harmful to bees?
They have agreed that they are harmful, but they think that the risk can be mitigated. One of the major risks from neonicotinoids for bees seems to be at the time of planting, you get this dust off. So they used to use like talc powder to smooth out seed delivery when they were putting seeds into the ground, and that would come off in these big plumes of dust, which would then get blown onto neighbors' properties. And that was pointed to as one of the major risk factors for bee kills from neonics. So manufacturers said, oh, well, that's just an equipment problem, right? not an actual problem with the product. So they agree that they're toxic to bees, but they think that the risks can be mitigated. We've learned from many different studies looking at offsite movement, you really can't control the movement of some of these things in surface water, and even when equipment and precision technology is employed, you're still getting problems with dust off. So I think that the manufacturers and folks like us have different perspectives, to put it lightly. Yeah.
A lot of people spray for ticks. Is that an issue?
So some tick sprays, like pyrethrins, are very toxic to bees. Essential oils can be repellent and toxic to bees, moderately toxic. I saw this in the back, there's a great handout here on landscaping to repel ticks without using pesticides. So if you haven't checked that out, I was very excited to see that here because it's got great recommendations on it. Yeah.
Do you have any pointers as far as hanging like a bee hotel up? 'Cause we bought a bee hotel up and we hung it and it's filled up with white-faced hornets.
Is it bamboo?
Yeah, I think
So- So the ones that have bamboo are very attractive to wasps, not very attractive to bees. I'm sorry if you have, some of them are great wasps, so there's like grass-carrying wasps, cricket wasps that will use those kinds of hotels, keep other pests out of your backyard. But if you want bees colonizing your bee hotel, get the ones that have, smaller 6 millimeter or less holes in them. So bees like to have a hole that's really the same size as their body, so that when they go into it, anything that's maybe on their back is getting brushed off at the entrance. So smaller bees are going to want smaller holes, and most bees are not going to nest in the bamboo ones because they're just too large and allow predators in. Yeah.
A question on the persistence of the neonics, because it's a dirty little secret, and many folks go out and they purchase plants and they don't realize that perhaps they were treated and they place them into their yard. So what's the management of that situation?
So if you do purchase a plant that has been treated with a neonic, and you put it out in your yard, we'd recommend clipping the flowers for the first year. Woody plants tend to have residues for a year, maybe 2 years if there was a really high treatment of neonics. The forbs tend to have sort of lower persistence levels, so within a year. But I would definitely recommend clipping flowers for the first year if it was treated with a neonic. Yeah.
Does the Pollinator Protection Act that was passed in 2016, doesn't that mean that nurseries aren't allowed to sell to individuals plants with neonicotinoids, or is that?
Is that a Connecticut specific
It is.
protection?
I think-
I'm not positive.
I think that landscapers can use those,
Okay.
use neonics, but that individuals can't.
You have to have a pesticide license in order to spray neonics.
Oh, right.
So the homeowner cannot purchase it.
But the homeowner can ask their landscaper, are you using this? Because landscapers are licensed to use it. So that's a way you can protect your yard, is just ask your landscaper not to use it.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Well, if you have any other questions, feel free to pull me aside after this. Thank you. Thanks for coming.